My wife and I had an opportunity to be in New York City for the first time last spring, and we wanted to try and go see a live taping of one of the evening Tonight Show kind of things. And we were able to get tickets to go see Late Night with Seth Meyers. And they give away more tickets than they need because they want to make sure the thing is full. So you got to get there and get in line. So we got to Rockefeller Center, and there wasn't a line yet, and then we came back, and there was a line, and we got in that line, and I can't tell you how long we stood there. But eventually it started moving, and we got to a place where they checked our tickets, and then we were still in line going up some stairs. When we got to the top of the stairs, they checked our tickets again, and then we got into a line that went kind of along a wall. Now that wall had a whole bunch of screens, and on those screens were all these different rotating images from the Late Show with Seth Meyers. And then we got up to the next point, and then they put us into a big room, which doesn't feel like a line, but you're still just sitting around waiting. You could go to the bathroom and mingle around. And then eventually they kind of gave instructions to everybody and then handed you a number, which put you in a line. Now that line was in a different place, and it was going to the elevator, and there were still screens up against the wall for all the Late Night with Seth Meyers stuff. But from there, you could see across the way, the next line was coming for the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, and all those screens had now changed to something else. And then that was the last line. But the whole time I was in those lines, I thought, yeah, this makes sense. It's NBC Universal. This company owns theme parks. They know how to make lines. And the way you make lines is you have it switching, what you're looking at, right? If it's just all the same thing, it takes longer. It doesn't, but it seems like it does. If there's screens and if there's fans and there's stuff moving around, it can make that 90 minutes or 2 hours that you're standing in line seem a little more tolerable. Now, here's what I have experienced living here in Orlando. I know people who know people. So I have been at the parks where the ride has, there's not even a line. Like, they're like, no more people. And then they go, well, but we know somebody. And then we get to go right past the whole line right to the front. How does that feel? Awesome. If you've been standing in line for 90 minutes and you see me just stroll up and go up to the front, how does that feel? That's frustrating, right? And if you've had a long enough day, you can even start to have that frustration get kind of angry, right? Like, we've been standing in line and these people are just skirting right on by. This is what I think is happening in the story we heard today from Jonah. Now, some of you know the story of Jonah better than many Bible stories because they made a VeggieTales movie about it and your kids watched it over and over and over. But I'll give you a quick recap. Jonah is a prophet that God says, go to Nineveh and tell the whole city that they're wicked. And Jonah says, no thanks, I'm going to go to Tarshish instead. And then ends up on a boat. There's a big storm. They don't know why. He says, throw me overboard. The storm stops. He gets swallowed up by a fish. He prays. Fish spits him out. And then God says, go to Nineveh, like I asked you last time, and tell the people there that I'm going to destroy the city because of their wickedness. And then Jonah's like, fine, and takes 3 days to walk across the city, just announcing, God's going to destroy this place because of your wickedness. And then we pick up the story right after the people of Nineveh have said, you know what? You're right. We should change. So they repent, they declare a fast, and they change their ways. And where we pick it up today, God changes God's mind and does not destroy the city. And then what happens to Jonah? He gets mad, right? Because presumably he has been doing the best he can to live faithfully. Maybe he's really generous. He goes to worship all the time. He gives alms to the poor. He helps his neighbor. And then he looks over at these people that are wicked, doing whatever they want, and God forgives them, and now they're both at the same place in the front of the line. He did all the hard work, and they did none of it, and then here they are in the same place. So he gets mad. Now, the first thing I think we can learn from this story is that God's grace is fundamentally unfair. Because when you look at all of that, it is unfair. Jonah was trying to be faithful, except when he didn't do the first time what God asked him to do. But the rest of the time, he's probably trying to be faithful, and those that didn't all get to end up right with God right at the end. And you can look and say, that's not fair. And yeah, it's not. But the other side of that is our actions have consequences. So while the Ninevites were all being wicked, they were having a huge negative impact on people's lives. If they robbed someone, those people lost some stuff. If they assaulted someone, those people experienced that trauma and carried it with them. Even though they were forgiven, all of that is still there, right? Those negative impacts of their actions carry consequences. Are those consequences fair? No. Now, Jonah, on the other hand, his actions have consequences too. When he was presumably being faithful, he was probably blessing people. When he chose to run away from God, a storm came and put a ship at peril, right? And so, while God's grace is unfair, we learn from this story that wickedness, or the choices we might have to live more faithfully, also have consequences in the world that aren't fair. So that unfairness of grace meets the brokenness and unfairness that we create. And ultimately, when Jesus goes to the cross, was that fair? He came and loved and showed mercy and grace and compassion and got executed for it, right? Do we all, any of us, want to be judged by God for the worst days that we had? No. So it's good that God's grace isn't fair, because ultimately that benefits all of us. The problem is we're really good at looking at other people going, yeah, but that's really unfair. So Jonah ends up getting mad. But the other interesting part about this is Jonah tells us why he didn't go the first time. He says, see, I knew you were going to forgive him. That's why I didn't go. I know you're a God that's slow to anger and merciful and prone to forgiveness. That's why I didn't go the first time. So Jonah tells us that he knew grace is unfair, and he chose not to participate in it because he didn't like that. We probably do that sometimes, right? And this is where all of the story, I think, we experience it in our own lives in different ways. I would bet most of you that have been in the working world have, maybe you were the one that showed up on time every day, stayed late when the boss asked, did all the things you were asked to do, did them well, redid them if they weren't right. And then there's that person in your office, and I worked with at least one of these people, more than one really, who never really shows up on time, takes really long coffee breaks, is really good at taking credit for other people's ideas, and somehow manages to get promoted. And you look at it and go, is that fair? And this is where we get, what's the term we have for this? Nice guys finish last, right? It's an unfair thing. So we experience all that in the world. So when we experience that unfairness, do we want to participate by sharing the unfair grace of God? And the answer is, not all the time we don't, right? And so we're right there with Jonah. So then, if we get to the space of understanding that the world's got consequences that aren't fair, and God's grace is unfair, yet somehow we might be called to participate in that, what then do we do with the rest of the story? And I think that we could look at the rest of the story and just talk about Jonah's response, right? He gets mad. So mad that he says, I would rather be dead. I was trying to think of an example of what this would look like in our present day world, and the best I could come up with is, many of you live in an HOA that's got some rules. Imagine your neighbor painted their house yellow with purple stripes and pink polka dots. They had a crazy, ridiculous fence made out of glass bottles and twine. They never cut their grass, and they put a permanent Santa Claus on the roof. And they got a work truck with all the logos parked in the driveway. Is that in any of the rules of your HOA? Now imagine that they said, you go out and announce to them that their house is going to get burned down if they don't start following the rules. That's basically what God has said, right? Announce their wickedness, they're not following all the rules, and then there's going to be calamity. And then imagine they go, oh, okay. And they take down all the bottles and twine and put up a real fence and cut the grass and paint the house the khaki color that's approved or whatever, and they get it all cleaned up. And then they say, okay, now we're not going to burn your house down. Jonah's response would be like you going, no, burn it down. I'd rather have a burned down house in the neighborhood and be dead than have them get that all cleaned up. That sounds ridiculous. The thing is, can we control our emotions? No. Lots of you know that Ted Lasso is my favorite TV show. There's an episode of Ted Lasso where one of the characters is having a problem with an emotion, And he comes to this other group of guys, and he's explaining it, and he's jealous mostly. And then somebody says something, he goes, listen, I can't control my emotions. And Ted Lasso says to him, well, then by all means, you should let them control you. Now, he's being sarcastic, but he's got a point. And that point is, no, we can't control our emotions. We don't choose to get frustrated. We don't choose to get angry. What we can choose is how to respond to it. And that's what I think this story is helpful with. Do any of the rest of you get honked at a lot on the road? I apparently do not leave right. I'm not already rolling when the light turns green. Last couple weeks ago, I had somebody pull up. I just saw them shouting at the car in front of them, gripping that you could just see the anger. And I know, watching that, it ain't about the traffic. Traffic is not that important to get that angry about. They got anger that's coming up from something else that's going on in life, and it's coming out in the traffic. I was at a light the other day, and there were 3 lanes of traffic going, and I could turn right on red except for 3 lanes of traffic full, and the person behind me was blaring on their horn, and when I could finally go, they sped around me, and you could just see, right? So one way to respond to our anger is let it out, right? And aim it at other people. In these particular cases, my guess is they're not letting it out someplace else, so it's coming out there, right? So you can tamp it down, you can let it out. The other thing is, and hopefully we're not doing this, but sometimes church people are pretty terrible at being angry at other people for something that, according to the story we heard today, is really none of your business, right? We have moved in the last 15 years to where, 2 men can get married, 2 women can get married. What does that have to do with your marriage? Nothing. And yet there are people that are so angry that they are out there, right, just lashing out with hate and all kinds of stuff. If they read Jonah, God says, what did you do, Jonah, to grow this bush of shade that now went away? And you didn't do anything for it, right? So maybe get your mind around that. Point is, sometimes we lash out at other people. Sometimes we try to bottle up our anger. Lots of these ways aren't super productive. What does Jonah do with his anger? He talks to God. He sits down on the hill. He could go back down the hill and yell at the Ninevites and say, this isn't fair, and blah, blah, and you did this, but he doesn't do that. He sits down on the top of the hill, and he has the conversation with God. And he says, yeah, I'm mad enough, I'd rather be dead. He says that twice. Now, if you read the Psalms, you will find other people that are not happy, right? And where do they point that anger? Right at God. There's a psalm, I think it's 137. It's during the time of the exile, and the people are so brokenhearted from being taken away from their land that they have hung their harps up on the trees, and they will not sing in the Babylonians' land. And it ends by saying to God, please take the Babylonians' babies and dash their heads against the rocks. That is a terrible sentiment. Who did they speak it to? God. They didn't go out and grab the babies of the Babylonian, right? They spoke it to God. So what we find in this story is that Jonah has this anger at the fundamental unfairness of grace, and instead of going out and lashing out at other people and letting that anger do harm in the world, he sits down and has a conversation with God. Now, at the end of it, we don't know what happens, right? It ends with God saying, you weren't responsible for any of this stuff being created or any of this forgiveness happening. This is all my work. Basically, God's saying, it's not really your concern. And by the way, God could have said, this grace is free for you too, right? And it's not really fair that you get it either. So get over yourself and go be faithful, right? We don't know that Jonah goes and does that, but we know that he has the conversation with God instead of being angry with other people. And I trust that in that conversation of prayer, that then shaped him to go out in the world differently. So for this story today, I think we can understand that grace isn't fair, but the world isn't fair, and that's God's response to that. God's love comes and finds us even in the wicked worst of places and can take us to places of transformation. And when we get mad about all that, we can have a conversation with God and trust that God's grace is big enough to handle our anger. And it can take that anger and shape us and mold us into being the faithful people that hopefully Jonah ends up being. But if he falls down in trying to be that faithful person, and if we do, guess what? God's unfair grace meets us again and carries us along in forgiveness. again and again as we grow into the people God created us to be. Amen.